Sensitive content for children, the principal says into a bright metal mic, not looking at me or my grandson. Her blazer crisp as fresh money, her smile thin and practiced, while he stands in the hallway's glass with a too-tight backpack, scuffed sneakers, and that brave way kids hold their breath when adults decide the air. Inside, the board sits under cold lights and a perfect clock, papers stacked like walls, and I feel the floor's lemon-clean shine under shoes that have known factory grit and funeral gravel. My palm on a scarred leather folder where a red-stamped page waits like a small door someone tried to paint shut. The room smells of toner and chilled dust, and the principal's eyes move past us the way a limousine window slides past a bus stop. Her voice soft, but sharp enough to cut a boy's name into silence while a compliance pen taps a rhythm that says, "Wait your turn." I am an old man with steady hands and a long memory, and before these lights cool, you'll see how one rule read aloud can make that door swing open. Before I go on, hit subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. If this speaks to you, share it. Awareness protects our elders. Sensitive content for children, the principal said into the mic, eyes skimming past me like I wasn't there. The words landed first, then the gavel tap, then the soft ripple of chairs settling as if the room agreed. I was already standing, my folder open on the side table, my grandson's notebook at the top where I could touch it with my fingertips. The floor smelled like new varnish and lemon cleaner. The air conditioner hummed through metal ducts. The clock above the dais ticked with a dry tin sound that trimmed every second into something neat and disposable. The principal didn't look at the papers I had placed down. She looked at the room, at the rows of faces, the name placards, the stack of agendas, and moved to the next line of procedure. I didn't clear my throat. I didn't ask permission. I placed my palm flat on the folder and felt the heat of my own hand make the leather warmer. I said, in the voice I keep for Sundays and appointments, that the proposal wasn't a fight over a holiday, but a lesson plan with supervision, a circle of listening with notes, a mural with sources. The chair of the board pressed lips together, polite as a courthouse window. To the chair's right, the compliance coordinator had already slid a thin pile of forms into place, fresh print, edges sharp. She didn't speak yet. She adjusted the corners until they aligned like a deck of cards. The principal repeated the phrase, "sensitive content for children," this time softer, like a reminder, and recommended shelving the item until further guidance. I let the sentence finish. The clock ticked. I drew the top sheet from my folder and put it where a person would have to reach to avoid it. The pedagogical opinion stamped on Columbus Day of last year, date plainly visible in a red rectangle that looked like a small door someone had already opened. Under it, the letter from the history teacher. Under that, the schedule my grandson and I had penciled on the kitchen table: prep, circle, community service, debrief, lines straight, times neat, handwriting calm. I didn't touch the notebook yet. I wanted that to stay on top, in sight, like a witness. The chair let the principal's recommendation sit a moment, then said the board would note the classification and move ahead with other business. A few papers rustled. Somewhere, someone's keychain brushed a metal chair leg and chimed with a tired little ring. I kept one hand on the folder and lifted the other just high enough to be on the record. I said I wanted the wording recorded exactly as delivered along with the materials I had placed before them, and that I intended to resubmit the item under the district student participation policy. The chair nodded like people do when they want to be fair without being changed. The compliance coordinator gave me an administrative smile and wrote something I could not read.
In the second row, the community mediator raised a hand, not to argue, but to ask if prior minutes mentioned comparable activities linked to civic dates. She had a manila folder with fluorescent tabs and a small notebook with a grid pattern that caught the light. The chair asked her to check. I moved my folder closer to the edge and squared the red stamp to the room. The varnish smell lifted a little with the air conditioner switching on and off. The hum fell away into the vents and came back, wider. My knees told me to sit, but I stayed standing. I wanted the board to feel my steadiness, not my years. The principal, still polite, said paperwork appeared incomplete. The compliance coordinator, now with a voice, said the wrong form had been used. She placed a fresh form in front of me as if I might have missed it at the door. I read the title, the date in the corner, the extra lines for supplementary rubrics. I ran my index finger down the margin and felt the slight ridge where the printer had left a tiny burr. The principal mentioned deadlines. The compliance coordinator said the window had closed. All of it tidy, all of it like a door that swings on a hinge you can't see. My grandson was not in the room. He was down the hall with his backpack zipped tight because that's how he likes it, everything inside in its pocket. He had asked if he should come in with me, but I told him no, that a hallway can be a kind of courage when you're 14 and the room is full of adults who have already decided what you might understand. The ally I had with me was the proof of his work, not his shoulders and not his voice. I kept the notebook visible because it held the sentences he had copied from library books, the questions he had written in pencil that left a shadow even after erasing, and the tiny map he drew of the mural wall with a line down the middle, one side for origin stories and one side for voyages, arrows pointing not at each other but at the same horizon. The mediator returned with a thin stack of older minutes, edges softened from handling. She placed them near the chair. The paper smelled a little like dust and glue. In those pages lived a youth project about a memorial garden after a local accident, a student-led panel on civic service, a display of historical photographs with captions reviewed by faculty. The chair flipped to a page the mediator marked and drew breath through the nose the way careful people do when they choose words. The compliance coordinator reached for the older minutes but stopped, hands hovering as if the paper might say something unhelpful out loud. I asked for the student participation policy to be read, specifically the paragraphs on supervised content, use of school spaces outside class time, and temporary displays created as part of academic reflection. The chair deferred, saying a copy could be provided later. I turned the page in my folder and produced the copy I had brought, printed last month, highlighted in soft yellow, folded once. The paper was warm from my palm in the room. I set it alongside the stamped opinion, edges aligned. The principal glanced down and then up, back to the room, measuring the distance between a citizen's patience and the clock face. The compliance coordinator, now helpful, tapped the new form again, suggesting it would cover everything if properly completed when the window opened next term. The phrase next term entered the air like a fog. It sounded reasonable. It also meant the conversation my grandson had started with his classmates would get pushed behind something else, the winter concert, testing week, the next small fire. I didn't look toward the hallway because I didn't want to picture his face when I told him to wait again. I settled my hand on the notebook instead and felt the raised wire beneath the cardboard cover.
A custodian rolled a cart across the back, wheels rubber soft, tray holding a stack of plastic cups and a jug of water perspiring in the cold air. The jug made tiny beads that dripped and dotted the tray. Someone coughed. The fluorescent lights clicked once, a thin insect sound from the ballast. The chair asked if I wished to add anything new beyond what had been presented. I said yes, a request that the supervisor from the district office be called to confirm the policy language and the status of deadlines and exemptions for supervised curriculum-linked student activities. The chair's eyebrows went up and down so quickly it might have been a blink. The principal's pen paused on the agenda. The compliance coordinator's hand slipped over the new form as if to keep it from moving. I kept my tone low and steady. I said I wasn't asking for anyone to pick a side between holidays, that what my grandson had faced this week wasn't a scoreboard matter, and that the remedy we were asking for was the one the policy already envisioned, a structured setting where children and families speak and listen under the shelter of rules we all agreed to follow. I added that the stamped opinion from the pedagogy team existed to prevent evenings like this from turning into long, sighing delays. I turned the page of the policy to the section titled Participation in Civic Learning Activities and placed my finger on the line that referenced administrative discretion guided by established timelines. A few heads turned toward the door as if a supervisor might walk in simply because we wished it. The mediator's pencil moved across her grid notebook, making a tiny, dry whisper with each stroke. My tongue tasted a metallic edge that sometimes comes when you haven't had water for a while, and I swallowed it away. I asked that the classification as sensitive content be recorded with the exact phrasing used, and that my resubmission under the student participation policy be entered into the minutes with the materials physically present for inspection. The chair nodded again, careful, non-committal. I glanced at the clock and felt how time can hold you still and also push you forward. I lifted the stamped opinion high enough that no one could pretend not to see it, the red box like a signal light, and said I would be requesting the district supervisor's presence immediately to verify deadlines, exemptions, and use of space rules. I didn't sit down after I said I would call the district supervisor. I kept my palm on the folder so the leather wouldn't slide across the polished table, kept the stamped page visible like a small red lantern. The chair's gavel didn't fall, but the room adjusted itself anyway, as if a current had shifted under the floorboards. Papers whispered against papers. Someone tapped a capped pen 2 times, then stopped. The air conditioner exhaled cool breath that smelled faintly of dust and metal, and the clock measured the air between us in small, dry clicks. The community mediator moved first. She slid to the side table with that quiet stride of people who know rooms like this and produced a stack of past minutes from her manila folder. The fluorescent tabs looked like little flags in a calm wind. She set the stack down near the chair and turned 1, 2, 3 pages to a section she had marked. I edged my copy of the student participation policy closer and lined it up with the stamped opinion, the teacher's letter, and my grandson's notebook, which I angled so the spiral wire caught the light. The smell of paper warmed by hands rose when I adjusted the pages, like a library on a summer afternoon. The principal leaned toward the chair, speaking with a smile that kept the voice small. The compliance coordinator stayed in her lane, lining edges, tapping the corner of a fresh form as if to rhythm could turn it into law. The chair kept an expression like weathered marble and asked whether someone from the district office could be reached. The mediators glanced at me for a second, just enough to say she'd make the call. I nodded. She stepped back, pulled a small phone from her jacket pocket, and whispered into it, one hand cupped around her mouth to keep the sound from scattering.
While she did that, the compliance coordinator slid a paper closer to me. The form was smooth and just warm enough to reveal it had been printed minutes ago. I felt the faint grit of toner on the header when I touched it. The font wasn't the same as the older forms. This one had extra blanks with names like Supplemental Rubric Alignment and Additional Community Review Period. The date in the corner was that morning. She said, in a voice that could pass for helpful, that this form would ensure proper safeguards if resubmitted next term. Next term hung in the air like steam that would not condense into water. I traced the top edge of my grandson's notebook with my thumb. The cardboard was soft where his backpack had rubbed it. I didn't open it. I didn't need to see what was inside to feel him there. He wasn't the ally you bring into a room to absorb a blow, not at 14. He was the ally who had done the work and trusted me to carry it to the table without dropping a single line. My phone buzzed once in my jacket pocket. I didn't fish it out. The vibration was enough to tell me he was down the hall and awake to this moment. A second later, it buzzed again, softer, as if it had rolled deeper into the lining. That was his rhythm when he didn't want to intrude. 2 taps, I'm here. The chair asked me to step to the side while they moved the agenda forward, a phrase that sounded like rainwater finding a gap under a door. I stayed where citizens are allowed to stand and said as gently as I could that any movement of agenda should reflect the policy we were confirming. The principal said there were parents to consider. The compliance coordinator said there were deadlines to respect. I pointed to the policy paragraph where timelines are guided by established calendars, but may include exemptions for supervised curriculum-linked activities with documented goals. I let my finger rest there until I felt the paper cool under my skin. The mediator returned to the table with her phone angled away from the microphones. She said she had reached the district office and that the supervisor would call back in 3 minutes, maybe 5. She whispered the number to the chair, who wrote it on the corner of the agenda and underlined it once, then again. The pen blared a little into the soft paper fibers. The principal folded her hands. The compliance coordinator let the fresh paper rest on the table like a clean plate waiting for a spoon. I breathed through my nose the way I used to when my wife would ask me to check something twice before we sent it in. The smell of lemon cleaner lifted from the floor when someone shifted their shoes, and the scuff sounded like a small violin string pulled tight. I asked the chair for the record to reflect that a newer form had been presented after my submission, which had followed the printed policy. I said I was not refusing any safeguard. I said I wanted the safeguards that were already written and not the ones invented by nerves. The chair wrote again, small Lupin letters, and the pen scratched like a cricket somewhere in a wall. Behind me, a door opened and let in a slice of hallway noise. A locker door clanged, a brief burst of laughter cut short, the rolling cart of the custodian again, wheels sighing over the seam in the tile. It closed and the sound tightened back into the room. At the edge of my vision, I saw a shadow move in the glass of the entry, a small shape with a backpack strap pulled tight across the shoulder. I didn't turn. I let the knowledge of my grandson's waiting anchor me. If I looked, I would reach for him, and this room was where I had to reach for the rules. The mediator put the older minutes in front of the chair, and I watched the chair's index finger trace a line across a page about a student-led panel held under similar conditions last spring. The finger stopped at the word supervised. The principal kept her eyes on the agenda left margin. The compliance coordinator shifted, and a soft paper hiss rose where her sleeve brushed the new form. The phone on the table vibrated once. The chair lifted it and angled the screen away. A hand covered the mic. A short exchange, a nod, and the chair set the phone down as if it were an egg that might crack. The district office would return the call in a minute. I used that minute. I pulled the policy printout toward me and slid a yellow highlighter from my folder, my wife's, the one she used to keep clipped inside a cookbook. and drew a soft line under the sentence that matched the older minutes. Projects may proceed under faculty supervision when aligned with curricular goals and documented for review. The ink smelled faintly of plastic and citrus. I folded the policy once to make it easier to display, then set it down so the highlighted line framed the red stamp on the pedagogical opinion like a bridge between two shores. I felt the weight of the room move, not toward me, not away, but into the middle, where paper and law live. The principal spoke about caution, about parents who might feel cornered by a topic that touches family. I said caution is a kind of love when it leads to care, and a kind of fear when it leads to delay. I said we were asking for a circle, not a verdict. My voice was even, but I could hear a tremor in the ductwork, a flutter that might have been the air conditioner or might have been my breath riding it. My phone buzzed again. 2 taps. I let it settle. My grandson had his own circle out there, friends, hallways, a school he was still choosing to believe in. He didn't need me to win anything right now. He needed me to keep the door open long enough for the rules to arrive. I glanced at the clock. The minute hand ticked into a new mark with a sound like a small nail. The mediator made a note in her grid, the pencil sound like sand on glass. When the chair's phone lit again, their face changed by a degree only people who live in meetings recognize. They looked at me and then at the principal. I heard the simple sentence all rooms wait for when they want to delay without saying delay. Please hold your place. It meant acknowledgement without movement. It meant stand still without sitting down. I held my place. I was older than anyone else in that room, and I had learned long ago that standing still can be louder than any shout if you do it under the right light. The compliance coordinator cleared her throat and offered me a pen to go with the new form. The pen cap clicked with a polite little snap. The paper waited like a calm face. I let the pen sit there. I picked up the teacher's letter instead, the paper thin enough to be transparent against the folder's dark leather. It smelled of printer heat and the faint afterscent of the teacher's classroom, dry markers, hand sanitizer, the cotton of a cardigan fresh from a drawer. I placed the letter back down and aligned the corners with the stamped opinion and the policy page, a quiet geometry to counter the tidy drag of bureaucracy. A chair creaked in the back. Someone whispered a question and swallowed a laugh. The custodian's cart had vanished. A single drop of water shivered on the table's edge where the jug had been and then fell, leaving a dark dot the size of a dime. The principal's bracelet made a small chime as she folded her hands again, and the compliance coordinator adjusted the fresh form so its margin almost overlapped my grandson's notebook. The chair lifted the gavel slightly and let it hover, the way you do when you plan to remind the room and not startle it. The microphone carried a soft breath. Before any words, the principal leaned toward the compliance coordinator, and I watched a whisper pass from mouth to ear like a paper airplane crossing a short distance. And then a new sheet slid out of a folder and landed in front of me with a weight that felt heavier than its paper could explain. The new sheet was bright and stiff, edges still warm from the printer. The compliance coordinator slid it toward me with 2 fingertips as if it might sting her to touch more of it. Across the top, the font was wider, bolder, a little smug. It asked for things I had not seen before: expanded risk assessment, external reviewer sign-off, additional community cooling period. It carried today's date in the corner like a flag planted on ground I had already walked. The principal looked past the paper to the room, toward the parents who might be watching this broadcast at home, toward the clock that kept slicing minutes with its dry metal tick. I put the new sheet beside the policy I had brought and felt the tiny burr on the cut edge catch my finger. I wasn't trying to make a scene. I was trying to make a picture
anyone could read. Old rule, new invention. Stamp, form, policy, improv. I asked the mediator to note the title and the date in the record, and to identify that it did not exist when my submission was made. She wrote quickly in her grid notebook, pencil leaving faint dust that caught the fluorescent light. I took a breath that tasted like cool dust from the adduct. I centered the stamped opinion again, a line in the red rectangle so it faced the chair. My grandson's notebook stayed at the top of the stack, wire spiral glinting like a small spine. I didn't open it. I wanted to cover the stand for the person not allowed at this table. If the room needed a face, it had one in cardboard and graphite. The compliance coordinator tapped the fresh form with a pen and said it would keep us all safe. Safe from what, she didn't say. The word safe can feel like a blanket or like a lock, and I have lived long enough to know the difference by the way people hold their shoulders when they say it. She held hers as if the word weighed nothing, and the paper did the work. The chair's phone buzzed. A hand covered the microphone. There was a nod. The chair announced that the district office was en route to the call, that we should refrain from speculation, that we would proceed with unrelated items and return when guidance arrived. I heard the soft rustle of agendas turning, the quick whisper of pages flipping past my item, as if paper could make distance. I asked to remain where I was with documents in view. The chair agreed with a neutral sound that might mean anything later. I remembered my wife telling me to be twice as patient as I wanted to be, and then add 5 minutes. The floor smelled faintly of lemon again as someone crossed the room, and the scent rode up with the cool air. I let my hand rest on the folder so the leather would absorb some of my heat. The board moved to facilities update. A parent representative asked about a cracked sidewalk slab. The compliance coordinator added the word hazard to a note. I stood in the frame of that camera shot like a coat rack while they did business around me. The mediator slid the older minutes back to me and pointed to the precedent I should mark. I used the yellow highlighter, the cap clicking softly, and drew a line under the sentence about supervised student projects that intersect with civic observances. The ink smelled like plastic and a citrus candy from a bowl near a receptionist window. I placed the policy page so the highlight sat directly under the red stamp on the opinion. It looked like a bridge, a small light between two known shores. My phone buzzed in my pocket, 2 taps. I pictured my grandson in the hall, shoulder against a cool cinder block wall, backpack strap pulled tight across his chest like he was holding himself together. I didn't check the screen. I pressed my palm flat over the place where the phone rested and held it there, not to quiet him, but to say I heard him. The facilities item ended with a motion to inspect. The gavel ticked the table once, a soft touch, not the sound that makes you jump. The chair lifted their eyes to me and then to the principal. The principal spoke about community trust and sensitive timing. Sensitive was back in the air again, followed by children, the way a train follows its tracks. I said the room had a tool for trust and timing, and that tool had a name, the policy. The chair wrote something I could not see. The compliance coordinator offered me the new form again, and the paper made a flat smile as it slid a half-inch toward me. I looked at the shape of the stack I had made, the notebook on top, the stamp at the center, the letter from the history teacher underneath with its classroom smell of dry marker and cotton, the policy page with its highlight. I moved the new form to the side and squared it with the table edge, a way of saying I could see it, but would not let it sit on top of my grandson's work. I asked that this ordering be reflected in the minutes, submitted materials, policy, newly introduced form.
The door at the back opened with a soft suction sound, and a cooler draft crossed my ankles. A whisper traveled before the body did. The mediator glanced up and then down, professional face back on. I didn't turn. I watched the chair's eyes move. I heard one of the microphones bump as someone shifted in their seat. The custodian's cartwheel squeaked out in the hall, then went quiet as if someone had set a foot to steady them. The sound of a key in a lock somewhere far down the corridor clicked, like the clock ticks had grown teeth. The compliance coordinator asked if I would be willing to start a fresh application to ensure alignment with evolving expectations. Evolving sounded like a plant growing toward a window. It also sounded like a way to let a season pass. I said I would follow the policy we had, and if it changed tomorrow, I would follow that tomorrow. But today, I was standing in the daylight of today. The principal folded one hand over the other and tucked her fingers under her wrist, like she was keeping a pulse quiet. I thought about my wife again. She would have stood right where I stood and organized the edges the same way, because order was how she made space when rooms tried to close. I felt for her highlighter in my pocket to make sure I would not lose it. The cap was slick, the ridges shallow. I ran my thumb over them so I could feel something that belonged to us and not to the room. The chair exhaled into the microphone, and the speakers made a soft breath noise that filled the rafters and then fell away. The phone on the table lit and darkened as text stacked and disappeared. The mediator reached for it, thought better, pulled her hand back, and made another pencil note in her grid. The graphite scratched like sand under a shoe. The district call came through. The chair pressed the green circle on the screen, and the tiny electronic chime sounded too cheerful for the room. A voice, tinny and flat, asked to be placed on speaker. There were pleasantries. The coordinator said the word sensitive again. The principal said children twice. The chair said policy, and the word sounded different coming from that mouth, like a box being set on a table with a certain care. The voice from the district said a supervisor was on the way from another meeting and would be in the room within minutes. The chair thanked the voice and set the phone down on its back so the camera faced the ceiling. The ceiling panels were clean, and the sprinkler heads looked like tiny stars. The mediator wrote, "Arrival in 3 to 5." I used the hinge of that moment to ask for a reading of the paragraph in the policy that mentions administrative discretion guided by established timelines and documented supervision. The chair read it. The voice traveled through the microphones and bounced off the varnished floor and came up into my chest like a sound I had heard once and then again years later in a different church. My hand got steadier. The compliance coordinator touched the corner of the new form with one nail and left a crescent mark pressed into the paper, a half moon.
The clock hands moved together with a small clack. I felt my knees, then my calves, then the soles of my shoes gripping the slick floor. I thought of the circle of chairs we had sketched in the notebook, counted them with my eyes while looking at nothing. I imagined a room where people waited for their turn to speak, and no one was forced to pretend they did not carry a past. I swallowed and tasted metal again, faint, but there. A shadow came across the glass of the door and paused. The hinge sighed. The door opened with a measured sound, not a rush. The supervisor stepped in, the kind of person who knows how to let a room see them without making a show of it. A dark overcoat folded over one arm, a slim folder in the other hand, the weight of weather still clinging to the cloth. The smell of cold air and car upholstery drifted in and then thinned. He went to the dais without hurry, nodded to the chair, nodded to the principal, glanced at the compliance coordinator's new form without touching it. The mediator slid the older minutes forward with 2 fingers and set the policy printout beside them. I rotated the stamped opinion so the red rectangle faced him like a steady light. He didn't sit. He leaned in, enough to read, not enough to crowd. He flipped the policy page with care and let it rest open. He read the line I had highlighted, then let his finger travel to the date on the red stamp as if measuring 2 shores on a small map. My phone buzzed twice against my ribs. 2 taps. I kept my eyes on the supervisor's hand. The room was quiet enough to hear the air vent sigh. I felt the edge of the table bite my thigh and did not move. The supervisor looked at the chair, then down at the stamp, then at the new form waiting like a shiny coin. And he spoke in a voice that was firm without being loud. If this is reaching you, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and send it to a friend who cares. He didn't raise the paper like a flag. He laid his hand flat on it and read the paragraph again, this time for the room and not just for himself. The microphones carried his voice without any extra shine. Administrative discretion guided by established timelines and documented supervision. He let the sentence finish, then tapped the date on the red stamp with the gentlest touch, as if confirming a pulse. The chair watched his finger, then looked at me. The compliance coordinator lowered her pen an inch. He asked the mediator for the date of my initial submission and the agenda when it was docketed. She answered without looking at her notes, then placed a small sticky tab on the older minutes where a similar activity had moved forward the previous spring. He followed the tab, read the line about supervised student work during civic observances, then breathed in through his nose the way people do when they decide to make something plain. He said the newer form was noted for future use, but not applicable midstream. The word midstream sounded like a rock placed in a creek to make the water honest about its path. The compliance coordinator nodded once, then moved the fresh form off my grandson's notebook and onto her own stack. It made a soft slide against the varnished table and settled like a page returning to a book. He asked the principal to articulate her caution so the minutes would carry it clearly. She did. Families, feelings, the tenderness of younger grades, and the responsibility of the school to avoid harm. He didn't counter. He reframed. He pointed to the section of policy that describes supervision, informed participation, and the use of appropriate spaces with adult facilitation. He asked the chair to read it again, and the chair did. The legal words, plain as bread, hung in the air with the hum of the ductwork and the faint lemon scent from the floor.
He moved next to the practical pieces. He asked the mediator for a list of spaces that had been used for similar events and which had adequate exits and sight lines for supervision. She pulled a page from her manila folder and named the multi-use room, then the library annex when available, and noted the hours when custodial staff were already present so the building would not carry overtime costs. The custodian had paused in the hall. I could feel his attention like a respectful shadow on the other side of the door. The supervisor asked that any chosen room be arranged in a circle of chairs with clear rules posted at eye level and a sign-in sheet for families. He spoke each element as if placing stones across a creek for a safe crossing. He turned to me and asked me to restate the structure of the plan so the record would carry my words and not only my papers. I described the preparation session with materials, the circle of listening with a teacher facilitating, the follow-up activity of community service linked to the topic, and a debrief with notes shared to those who participated. I kept my voice slow enough that each step could find a place on the page of the minutes. The chair's pen moved, the nib whispering like a moth's wing. He asked if I would accept a condition for informed family participation, written notice ahead of time, and an option for an alternative activity supervised by a different staff member for those who chose not to attend. I said yes, and it felt like agreeing to put another rung on a ladder so more hands could hold it steady. He said the circle would be for older grades only, and that the mural, if approved later, would be temporary and curated by faculty, with student contributions reviewed before display. The principal's shoulders eased a fraction, like a knot loosening under warm water. He asked the compliance coordinator to identify what paperwork existed already for sign-in and supervision, and to adapt rather than invent.
She found a familiar form for club meetings and another for parent information nights. He asked that the header be updated to reflect supervised civic learning activity, and placed a note that no additional rubric beyond the teacher's letter and the stamped opinion would be required for the listening circle. The new form with the bold font sat quiet in her stack, uninvited into this moment. That subplot, the paper with the heavier shadow, had reached its landing and would wait for another day. The mediator raised the older minutes again, this time pointing to a brief line about posting a short summary afterward to the school website, topic addressed, number of attendees, and next steps with no personal details. The supervisor said that was good practice and asked the chair to include it as a recommendation rather than a mandate, so the plan would not turn into a performance. The chair underlined recommendation twice. He returned to the stamped opinion, the red box bright as a small door against brown leather. He asked me to confirm the origins of the date. I said the review had been conducted last fall, annotated by the pedagogy team, and stamped on that holiday for the simple reason that it was when they met. I said the stamp didn't pick a side in a calendar argument. It marked the day a team did their work. He nodded once, a human gesture with no courtroom show in it. He asked the principal if there were any staffing concerns for a teacher to facilitate. She said the history teacher who wrote the letter could do it with another teacher present. The mediator added that she could be there to support group process if needed. The supervisor asked the custodian at the door, by his name, whether the multi-use room would be available at the proposed time, and whether chairs could be arranged in a circle without blocking exits. The custodian answered from the hallway in a voice that carried a practical kindness. He said he could help set the room, and then stepped back so the door could close again without noise.
The supervisor turned to the chair and asked for the record to reflect that a citizen had submitted materials according to policy, that a mid-process change had been set aside, and that the proposed activity, if kept within the policy's conditions, was eligible for consideration within the current term. He asked that the minutes include the location of the policy paragraph read aloud and a citation to the older minutes as precedent. He asked that the mediator prepare a simple checklist to accompany the circle: room, facilitator, posted rules, sign-in, consent notices, follow-up debrief. The checklist would keep the circle from turning into a speech and hold the edges of the conversation the way a hoop holds fabric while you stitch. I felt my phone buzz through my jacket lining. 2 taps again. I pictured my grandson shifting his backpack from one shoulder to the other, counting his own breaths the way I was counting mine. I did not look. I let the knowledge of him anchor me while the room adjusted its furniture and its posture. The edges of humiliation, sanded by process, were not gone. They were shaped now into something I could set down without cutting my hands. The chair asked if I had any final clarifications for the record. I said only this: that our aim was not to settle old wars with children, but to give them a place to name what history feels like and to practice listening with a teacher at the helm. I said we would bring the same respect to the circle that we asked from the room tonight. The chair wrote that sentence nearly word for word. The sound of the pen slowed and then stopped. The principal spoke about communication to families, using language that would not alarm or oversimplify. The supervisor agreed and suggested a template: what the circle is, what it isn't, who will be present, how to ask questions, and where to find support if the topic stirs up feelings at home. He asked for a note that participation would be voluntary and that an alternate supervised activity would be offered. The compliance coordinator wrote the template title on a yellow pad and circled it twice. a quiet acceptance of a job that could be done without making a mountain. The mediator tallied the conditions in her grid cells and drew a box around them, then another box labeled room, date, time. She turned to me and asked me to confirm my availability during those hours. I said yes. The chair checked the calendar and read 2 possible slots late next week that didn't conflict with testing or the choir program. The words "late next week" sat in the air like a bridge I could actually see. They didn't push us past the horizon. They walked us to it with both feet on the ground. He asked that the stamped opinion, the teacher's letter, and the policy page be scanned into the record that evening so there would be no doubt later about what had been present on the table. The mediator wrote "Scan tonight" with a small arrow pointing to her own name. The compliance coordinator, faced with work she recognized, gathered the appropriate forms like someone packing familiar tools. The principal, hands still folded, breathed in and out through her nose, shoulders settling into a shape that could carry caution without turning it into a wall. The supervisor stepped back half a pace so he could see the whole arrangement at once. Paper, people, clock, door. He asked the chair to summarize the next steps for the broadcast in the minutes, not as a decision, but as a route. The chair did. Verify space, confirm facilitators, prepare notices, collect consent, arrange sign-in, hold circle under policy, debrief. Each word landed like a small stone, and together they made a path I could trace with my eyes. He didn't end with a flourish. He ended with a simple request that the room treat the next moments with the same care it had given to the paper, because people would sit in those chairs soon and bring their homes with them. The chair thanked him. The mediator capped her pencil and slid it into the notebook's loop. The compliance coordinator placed the new form under her yellow pad and closed it, an ordinary motion that folded that thread away. The principal adjusted the microphone as if rediscovering its weight.
I looked at the stack I'd made and saw it now less as a defense and more as a kit. Stamp, letter, policy, notebook. The notebook still on top, the wire spiral glinting under the lights, my grandson's work waiting for a room shaped to hold it. The clock ticked. The lemon scent thinned, replaced by the neutral breath of the vents and the light paper smell of documents after they have been handled by careful hands. I rested my palm on the leather again, not to pin anything down this time, but to feel the warmth of the folder return to my skin while the room prepared itself for what would come next. The chair cleared their throat and asked the room to return to the item that had been set aside. The microphones breathed in and out, a low hush through the speakers. The supervisor remained near the dais with one hand on the policy page, the red stamp a steady square in his periphery. The mediator uncapped her pencil again and hovered over the grid. The principal shifted her chair so the feet settled evenly on the varnished floor, and the compliance coordinator drew her yellow pad closer as if pulling a shield into place. The chair summarized the route the room had just shaped. Policy paragraph read into the record. Mid-process changes set aside. Eligible activity under supervision. Sign-in and consent. Circle in a room with clear lines of sight. Optional alternative. Debrief noted. The words made a clean frame around the papers we had worried at for an hour. The chair asked if there was a motion to adopt the summary as instructions for staff to proceed within the policy. A voice from the end of the table said so moved, steady as a level placed on wood. Another voice seconded. The gavel didn't fall, it hovered like a small moon above the table. Discussion, the chair said. The principal spoke first. She didn't argue the summary. She described her concern in the plain language of someone who knows a building's moods. Young students, families that receive letters with hearts in their throat, the need for clarity so no one feels ambushed by a topic that touches home. The supervisor asked her to specify the notifications and supports she believed were necessary. She named them: a letter with simple words, a number to call, the teacher's presence, and a note that the circle is voluntary. The mediator wrote each phrase in a box: letter, number, teacher, voluntary. The compliance coordinator asked whether guardrails could be included so that no display appeared without review. She was careful now to speak from familiarity instead of invention. The supervisor answered that the listening circle was not a display, and that any visual component proposed later would be brought back with a faculty-curated plan. The coordinator's shoulders lowered a notch, and she turned the bright new form face down under her pad with the kind of quiet you use when you put a tool back on the right shelf. The mediator asked to read a sentence from the precedent minutes. Topic addressed without naming individuals, materials available on request, and a follow-up date scheduled for feedback. The chair agreed. The sentence sounded like a small good habit, the way you wipe a table in the same direction every time. The custodian, still a shadow by the door, shifted his weight. The wheels on the cart out in the hall whispered and was still. The chair looked along the table to see if anyone else wished to speak. I stood where citizens stand and said only what fit inside the margin of this moment. I said the circle was a place to practice listening, not to settle symbols. I said the policy was a shield for children and for the adults who guide them. I said we were asking the room to honor its own words and to let our school practice them under lights we could all see. The chair wrote something, then set the pen down with the tip facing the page like a compass pointing home. The chair called the vote. Hands rose, one after the other, like a row of small doors opening. The compliance coordinator's hand went up too. The principal's hand followed, slower, deliberate. The chair waited a beat, then counted them. The gavel touched the table with a calm sound that felt heavier than wood. The motion carried. The summary became instruction.
The consequences were set down clearly, not as punishments, but as repairs. The chair asked the principal to coordinate a staff session on handling civic topics under the policy, with the supervisor providing a frame and the mediator offering process supports. The principal agreed, and for the first time that evening, looked at me directly and said she would take responsibility for communicating with families in language that is careful, without being afraid. The compliance coordinator was directed to retire the interim form, to draft a memo clarifying that new templates take effect only at the start of an application period, and to ensure that the rule lives where staff can find it and not in anyone's drawer. The chair requested that future agenda packets include the policy page whenever an item touches student participation, so the rule walks into the room with the papers and not behind them. The supervisor asked the board to set a brief follow-up check at the next meeting, not a re-argument, just a report that the room was set, the circle held with supervision, participants signed in, notices sent, debrief done. The words landed like pegs on a tent line, holding the shape of what would be shelter. The mediator drew a small circle on her grid and wrote "next meeting" inside it, then underlined it twice. I let my hand fall to the folder and felt the leather warm under my palm. The air conditioner exhaled a ribbon of cool across my ankles. The lemon scent had faded into the cleaner smell of paper and the faint heat of electronics under the dais. I thought about the hallway where my grandson waited. I pictured his backpack zipper, the scuffed black toe of his shoe, the way he counts when he's nervous, 1 to 4, then back again. I did not move yet. I stayed in the center of the room's new shape so it could hold itself a minute longer. The chair asked if there was any final clarification needed for the record. The compliance coordinator stated for the minutes that the classification-sensitive content had been entered earlier and was now superseded by the policy's supervised learning framework. She read the word supervised slowly, honoring it like a key returned to the hook where it belongs. The principal added that the notice to families would make clear the purpose and structure, and that an alternate activity would be provided without penalty to any student who chose it. The mediator noted that the website summary would avoid personal detail and list materials by category rather than title. Each line tucked a frayed edge back into place. I thought of my wife's highlighter and how she used to draw a quiet line under sentences that mattered. I raised the yellow cap and touched it to the policy page one last time, not to add anything, just to feel the small give of the plastic. I slid the policy under the stamped opinion so the two rested together. I set the teacher's letter on top of both. Then I placed my grandson's notebook above them all, the spiral a little bent at one corner, the cardboard cool against my palm. The stack didn't feel like a defense anymore. It felt like a promise kit, the pieces you bring when you intend to build something in the open. The chair thanked the supervisor for the guidance and the mediator for the record keeping, then thanked me for the patience I loaned the room. Thank you is a small phrase. It doesn't erase anything, but in the right place, it lets a long breath out of a day.
I let mine out. The hum of the vents settled back into the rafters. The gavel tapped once more, and the chair moved to the next item. The voices around the table shifting from policy to parking lot lines, like a car changing lanes with its blinker on. The big clock over the dais cut another minute neatly in half, and then another. I stayed until the mediator reached for the stack. She asked if I wanted to keep my copies. I said I had scanned everything in my head already, and that she should take what needed to be in the record. She smiled, the first real smile of the night, quick and human, then slid the pages into a crisp folder and wrote my name on the tab with a careful hand. I lifted the notebook and slipped it back into my folder, the leather creaking the way it does when you have filled it with things that finally belong somewhere. The wire spiral brushed my knuckles like a cat's whisker. I didn't have to rehearse what I would tell my grandson. He had lived the week with me. He would read the shape of my shoulders and know enough. Through the glass, the hallway light made a pale stripe on the floor. I imagined him there, not heroic, not erased, simply ready to carry his share and set it down in a circle made for voices. The chair recognized the next speaker. Pages turned, pens scratched, a chair leg squeaked, and someone cursed under their breath, then apologized. I closed my folder and held it against my chest, the way you hold a small box that carries something fragile you have decided to keep. The ink on the red stamp had dried hours ago, maybe months ago when a way that counted. The policy words were older than that. Tonight, they were not a wall. They were a door, and I had learned again how to knock until it was opened. When memory hurts, the rule kept in daylight teaches us to listen without fear and to build the future with both hands. If you valued this story, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you would do in my place. Until the next story.